Hello, everybody. It's once again time for a new installment of the For a Better Web podcast, in which I, Bruce Lawson, Technical Communications Officer at Vivaldi, have a convivial fireside chat and then waterboard somebody who, in their own way, in their own community, is fighting for a better web. And today I'm very honored to have as my guest somebody who she'll be horrified to learn, but somebody whom I consider to be a friend, Léonie Watson, all the way from sunny Bristol in the United Kingdom. And Léonie is one of the founders and directors of an accessibility consultancy in the UK called TetraLogical, based in the UK, but working worldwide, as we all do. And somebody who's got her fingers in lots of pies at the W3C. So, hi, Léonie. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
Hello. Yeah, I'm really well, and all the better for being here and chatting to you, of course.
I'm very sorry I accused you of being a friend. We can edit that out later with your lawyers. Send us a cease and desist letter. How long have we known each other? I mean, it's got to be nearly 20 years when we actually first met in person at the British Standards Institution, was it?
I think that might have been the time we sort of first really, hung out for a while together. I think the first time I met you was at one of the app medias in the middle 20s, 2005, 2006, maybe, something like that. So, yes. Yep.
Gosh, the British Standards Institution, we were part of the committee drafting the immortal BS 8878, which is,
yes.
Do you remember what its title was?
No, to be honest with you, it's a part of my life I try very hard not to think about.
Yes. Those kind of committees can be quite tedious. It was a standard for commissioning accessible websites. So tell us, Léonie, for people watching, maybe you can see, people listening you can't, but you are a full-time screen reader user, I believe, but you weren't born blind, were you? Do you want to tell us your journey there?
Sure. Yes, you're right. So I lost my sight just around the turn of the century. Before that, I'd been working as a web designer, as we used to call them back in the day.
Gosh.
So I'd actually done a performing arts degree or equivalent of. Quite quickly realized I wasn't going to become as famous as I thought I would like to be. Got a job, and it just happened to be working on the tech support help desk for one of the first ISPs in the UK. As a consequence of that, came across this thing called HTML and then this thing called CSS, and decided I really quite liked it. It kind of tapped into the creative part of my brain and the bit of me that's always quite liked sort of technical engineering stuff. So yeah, I was working as a web designer until 2000, when I lost my sight. Took a bit of time out, as you might imagine. I went back to work, and it so happened to go to work for a company that built websites, but had a strong interest in kind of UX or usability, as it was more often called back then, and accessibility. Got introduced to accessibility as a kind of topic, and really kind of got bitten by the bug. Interestingly, I suppose, not because I can't see, and I kind of wanted to fix all the things for me. Also, yeah, having a vested interest is absolutely useful. It's more about the problem solving. Just this whole idea of there's this thing that doesn't work for as many people as it should do. How do we take it apart and put it back together in a way that does? And that's the bit I like. And even now, we're working at TetraLogical with some organizations that are really kind of pushing interface design. They're coming, really complex interface components and things that haven't got documented patterns. There aren't blueprints out there they can just copy. So flexing those kind of creative muscles and going, how the hell do we do this? And make sure that, what's good for me as a blind person works for someone who's deaf, works for someone who's, got learning disabilities, whatever it may be. And that's the fun of it for me, I think.
So when you lost your sight, there was already a web, which you've been working on, so you knew the nuts and bolts of it. And presumably there were, screen readers already available on consumer computers, and presumably it's pre-mobile days, but from the time that you needed them, there was assistive technology available, I'm guessing.
Yes, they did exist, but in a much more limited way than they do now. So Macs didn't have a screen reader at all.
Mm-hmm.
Not one that came with it, not one that you could install. So Windows was your only choice. Worked well for me because I was and always have been a Windows user by choice. But screen readers back then were all proprietary,
Mm-hmm.
hellishly expensive. Hundreds of pounds expensive, and that was 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, as you said, touchscreen devices have come along, and the screen reader landscape has changed. Mac iOS comes with an integrated screen reader. Windows has got one. There's also a free open source screen reader for Windows. Android's got a built-in screen reader, so it's lovely. Back when I lost my sight, you had to use Windows and you had to pay for your screen reader. Now you can choose the platform you want because it's the platform you want, not because it's the only one with the assistive tech on. So that's been a really lovely change over the past couple of decades.
Oh, that's great. And presumably, if we're talking, excuse me, the early 2000s, there was at least an awareness in the web development industry of accessibility, because it was 2000 that landmark court case took place at Mr. Bruce Maguire, if I remember correctly, great name, who sued the Sydney Olympics Committee because he couldn't buy a ticket to the Olympics with a screen reader. And from what I remember, there were already guidelines from the W3C about accessibility, or was WCAG, that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, folks listening at home, had WCAG come out yet then? Do you remember? I can't.
Just about, yes. The first version came out in 99. So, yes, they predated the Sydney case by about a year, I would imagine. To be honest with you, I don't recall now whether they were cited in the case against the Sydney Organising Committee for the Olympic Games, because that case was 2000 when the Australian Olympic Games. So I imagine they probably were, because absent sort of WCAG, there was nothing else to sort of frame a complaint around in terms of guidelines. But, they did exist anyway.
And they've continued. So I mean, now we're on WCAG 2.2, I think, and the third version is grinding through the sausage factory that is the W3C, I believe.
It is, and that's a very good way to describe it. It's a long way off yet. At least a couple of 3 years, I would imagine, because it is going to be a revolution rather than an evolution. Even the jump from 1.0 to 2.0 back in 2008 was an evolution of sorts. There were still 3 levels. That didn't really change. Some stuff did change, but it wasn't, an entire reinvention. And of course, 2.1, 2.2 have just carried on evolving the original 2.0. 3 is going to be quite substantially different, because at least some of the goals are to fix some of the inherent problems we've got with the current versions of WCAG. They don't, for example, cater very well to criteria around people with cognitive disabilities, because WCAG 2.0 is very much predicated on, can it be tested? Is it a yes answer or a no answer? That's a theory anyway. It doesn't work like that in practice. But when you're dealing with something, like ADHD or, anxiety or something like that, stuff gets complicated because people are complicated. And when you add in, kind of neurodivergence to the mix, stuff gets really complicated, and it's not a simple yes, no, binary answer. So that's one of the things that we're really hoping 3.0 will let us better do, which is, reflect more people's disabilities and kind of needs.
So this is a good thing if it's taking into account neurodiversity, cognitive disability, etc. But like you say, hard, because what might be great for somebody with autism might not be great with somebody, I don't know, who's got anxiety or ADHD. And how do you square that circle? What is it all about? Letting people choose their interface more, or?
It may well be. That's one of the reasons this is going to take a little while, is because they're not easy questions to answer. And of course, then whatever it is we come up with, we've got to make it into a technical standard. At the end of the day, this has to be a usable document. So yeah, there's some big challenges, but I absolutely believe this is necessary now. 2.x has served us well. But for those of us old enough to remember, the last days when WCAG 1 was still the official standard, we were bending it to the point of breaking because the web platform had moved on. We understood more about people. And we're at that same point now with WCAG 2. I think there's just too much in there that we're having to kind of bend the rules on and try to make it work. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and there's lots of sort of exegesis involved. What exactly do they mean by color contrast? what exactly does that word mean? What was the intention? It's it's very complex. TetraLogical, folks at home or wherever you're listening to this, TetraLogical is the consultancy, a commercial consultancy that Léonie and some of her chums founded. But TetraLogical as an org does lots of work with W3 and standards, etc., don't you? So that's presumably, unless I've really misunderstood the business model of the W3C, that's pretty much pro bono work that you are doing rather than billing clients for stuff. Why? Why do you do that? Are you just lovely, saintly people?
You've met us before. I think you know the answer to that question.
Exactly. That's why I'm asking you publicly.
It's really because TetraLogical, when we founded it, we put together 4 principles that we wanted to use to sort of guide everything we do. Around being ethical, inclusive, original, all of those kind of things. And being part of the W3C really speaks to that. W3C has always felt to us like an amazing community. We can be there. We can take part in working groups and activities that are producing standards that pretty much the entire web uses in some way, shape, or form. And it's important to have people with disabilities involved in that conversation. It's really important for accessibility, amongst many other things, to be throughout that whole conversation. And so if we can get involved and help keep moving that forward, that seems like a really good idea and a worthwhile thing to spend some of our kind of time on when we're not working on billable projects. And the fact that we can turn up there as a company of, what are we now, 12 people, and I can have a conversation with representatives from Apple, Microsoft, Google, from universities, from pretty much every sector and dimension and size and shape of company. They're conversations that we as a company couldn't have anywhere else. And yet we have that ability to influence and change and shape people's minds and do all of those things. So yeah, it just seems like a worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, amen to that. And also it has, a useful, workable standard makes your jobs easier when dealing with clients. If you can say, I wrote this bit of the standard, or I was there, I know what this means, that makes you potentially more attractive as somebody to hire rather than, Joe Cowboys Accessibility Limited, and if there is a Joe Cowboys Accessibility Limited, I'm terribly sorry. I just made that up. Please don't send me a cease and desist letter. I mean, it's good, isn't it? Because it puts the name TetraLogical out there. You get invited to speak at events, you in the plural, because I know that lots of your chums at TetraLogical are involved with stuff, and you personally are a co-chair of the web apps working group at W3C. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Yes, I co-chair it with Marcos Caceres from Apple at the moment.
I knew Marcos Caceres when he was Marcos Caceres at Opera, and
Indeed.
then at Mozilla.
Yes.
Could you tell us, well, don't tell us briefly, tell us in as much space as it needs, what is the Web Apps Working Group? What's the remit? What are you actually working on?
So I jokingly refer to it as the odd sock drawer of W3C working groups, because we have actually an uncommonly large number of specifications on our charter, and they're generally unrelated to each other. So we have things like the gamepad API, index DB, pointer lock, screen orientation, intersection observer. So it really is just a sort of collection of kind of APIs and specifications, all browser implemented specifications. So yeah, it's kind of hard to describe, which is why the odd sock description. But yeah, that's what we do.
That's got to be incredibly hard to get your head around. I mean, I once tried to read the index DB specification, which is why my hair's white. And again, for people back at home, index DB is a storage mechanism inside browsers, so that a web app, if there's a difference between a web app and a website, that's a point of contention. But on the spectrum between site and app, you might want to be storing client data in the browser, so you don't have to do server round trips, etc. But that's a very different beast from, say, pointer lock, which is, as far as I know, largely concerned with gaming, for example, so that your cursor or mouse pointer might be on the Pac-Man or on the spaceship that you're controlling or whatever.
Right.
How do you personally manage to keep all this stuff in your head at the same time?
So web apps is lucky in that the people who participate are almost exclusively browser engineers for one company or another, as you might imagine. And we've got a really, really capable set of editors. But the editors are not the same for every spec. So most working groups will work on a small number of specifications, sometimes even one. So they'll have one or two specifications, probably the same editors working on them. In web apps, we have different sets of editors working on pretty much every single spec. But they're all an absolutely wonderful group of talented people in every case. And so there's really just good knowledge from each of them on the spec they're editing, as you might imagine. I've got Marcos, who's a browser engineer himself. So he is the one of the two of us who really gets in amongst the weeds of the kind of the engineering side of the specs. I generally try to keep pace. Sometimes I fail. Quite often I fail, but tend to help out more with the kind of the logistical side of things. And that works really well because I don't need to understand it in the way that a browser engineer does, because I can trust Marcos, my co-chair. I can trust the editor engineers to know what they're up to, and the rest of the working group, to comment, provide review and feedback. And, when we get to the point of releasing specs, of course, the wider community, the horizontal review groups for accessibility, privacy, security, internationalization, and such. So that's kind of how I make it work. I don't make any pretense to being a browser engineer. But yeah, don't really need to.
What are these horizontal review groups? I haven't heard that term before. So every spec has to go to an accessibility review group and an internationalization review group, etc.
Yep, this has been part of the W3C's process for certainly as long as I can remember, and probably an awful lot longer than that. So yes, there are accessibility, internationalization, privacy and security, and early stages of development for a fifth, which is sustainable review. And the idea is that at least twice in its evolution from being what we call a first public working draft, so the very first version of a spec that gets written up, right through to the point where it becomes close to an official recommendation of the W3C, at least 2 points, the spec has to undergo review by those horizontal groups, and call them horizontal because they span everything the W3C does. And I think it's unique in standards organizations, and it's one of the reasons I really like the W3C, is because from the get-go, they've acknowledged that these things are actually bloody important, and we need to bake them in. You can't just come along and pay lip service to them. So yeah, that's a core part of how standards are developed then.
I mean, that's one of the things I've had much less to do with the W3C than you, but one of the things I've always admired, when we were doing HTML inverted commas 5, there was a really good document about the design principles of HTML, which very much baked those things in as well. You know, we must consider internationalization because it's a World Wide Web. We must consider accessibility because it's not only for people who can control a mouse and see a screen, and those things are baked in right from the start, which means, of course, that the process can be slower, but that's a good thing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, by the time something is released by the W3C as a recommendation, you can trust in the fact that it's undergone these reviews at least twice, that issues have been addressed. And that's probably worth calling out specifically, is that, you know, if the security, you know, review turns up something that's pretty disastrous, it has to get fixed before the spec can kind of move on to its next milestone release. So it's not just that the review happens. Yeah, stuff's got to get fixed before it goes on. So from the point of view of people who want to consume and use these standards, you've got a reasonable degree of trust that actually, yeah, accessibility has been thought about, privacy has been thought about, security. And because, you know, W3C also looks at implementation experience, so has everything in the spec been implemented in at least 2 things, browsers for browser specs, e-readers, whatever it may be, it doesn't matter. Again, from the point of view as a person using one of these technologies, you've got a reasonable, you know, way to kind of think, actually, this is going to be usable in production. You know, if it's supported in, you know, Safari and Chrome, for example, yeah, actually, you've got pretty good production coverage in whatever it is you want to build if you want to use that technology. And I think that's a good thing from a kind of working designer developer point of view.
And production, of course, in the case of a browser spec, is 4.5 billion people potentially using it in one browser or another. I mean, this is the biggest production, in inverted commas, that it's ever been possible to have in the world in tech, and it's all got to be backwards compatible too, or at least. It's quite extraordinary anything works at all, isn't it?
It is. I often think that. But you're right. But yet, somehow, yeah, the group of companies that come together at W3C managed to make it happen. And yeah, it is remarkable. You're right.
I assume with a lot of the web app specs, you know, things like pointer lock and I know screen lock and full screen and all of these things that people want, particularly on mobile devices, to make things look more app-like. I assume a lot of these specs have actually been implemented by somebody in a proprietary manner first, and then they retrospectively get standardized. You know, much in the same way that 10, 15 years ago, we took things like video that were the province of Flash and used that experience of the people who'd implemented it and brought them into the W3C to get them implementing it into the standard. So these things don't just get dreamed up one day by you in the shower, do they? It's somebody who has seen this in Safari or seen this on iOS or written it in Chrome, written it on Android, and then wants to bring it to the World Wide Web. Is that how it works, or how does a spec get kicked off?
I mean, yeah, it certainly can work that way. You know, there's a native platform feature that people think, actually, we should have this in the browser. Usually, specs, certainly in the web apps kind of sense, you know, they originate with one or more browser engineers for one of the companies that usually produce, you know, the engines rather than sort of browsers themselves. But yeah, and they will kind of start working on an incubation idea. There's a community group which is open to the public, the Web Incubator Community Group, and that's where you can pitch ideas, you know, see if there's any other interest from other implementers, other browser vendors, and start kind of fleshing out the ideas. And yes, you're right. You know, there will be a certain amount of implementation that goes on before it shifts onto what we call the rec track, the recommendation track, moves into a working group like web apps or something like that. But you know, sometimes these ideas are kind of really new, because they don't exist, outside the browser. There's something, but you're right. There is a definite kind of, we can do this somewhere else. Why can't we do this in the browser? Kind of thinking that goes into it for sure.
Which is great, because it means if somebody has implemented it, albeit in a proprietary way, there is experience of the potential pitfalls somebody somewhere might have thought on that proprietary platform, how to expose this to assistive technologies, how to ensure that it works with right to left languages. So it's somebody's come in with prior knowledge. But it's interesting that, is it usually somebody who's implemented this in a proprietary platform comes and says, let's put it on the web? Because it strikes me that that's kind of weird that somebody might want to give up a competitive advantage and put it on the web. Why would they do that?
I don't know that they do. I certainly can't think of any examples off the top of my head. As I say, most, if we're looking at the sort of the functional feature type specs in web apps, most of them do come from browser teams. Where they got the idea from is not always obvious. But I don't think I can think of any time where, to use your earlier example, where Adobe would have come to us and said, "Hey, let's take one of our proprietary features and make it available on the web." Maybe that has happened. I just can't recall any particular examples.
Yeah, and I know that you're not dissing Adobe. I mean, bless them. They've put Photoshop on the web, and not just pretend Photoshop. They've ported 20 plus years of C++ code to work on the web. So it's not like they individually are anti-web. And it's encouraging that your co-chair is Marcos from Apple, because I personally maybe have thought that Apple were not particularly invested in web apps, but Marcos is a really talented web-focused bloke. So that gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling on this a misty autumnal morning.
Yes, it's true. I mean, Apple is involved in a bunch of different areas, not just working groups either, which is something I do find encouraging, because I hear what you're saying. They've got a person serving on the advisory board, at the W3C. So that's the group that advises the team, the CEO, on matters that are important to the members. As I say, there are in and amongst the working groups, web apps has not just got Marcos as co-chair, but there are other Apple people involved there too. So it's encouraging, and it's the same for all. Microsoft kind of took a little bit of a step back over a few years, sort of after the HTML5 kind of time. But actually, it was really encouraging at the W3C's annual conference back in September, starting to see, lots more representation from the Edge team, which is ebb and flow of standards work. We know how it goes, but it's really good to get, contributions and participations from all of the kind of key companies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Vivaldi, we use Chromium as the engine upon which we build the browser, and I know a lot of contributions have come from Microsoft into Chromium. It's the ebb and flow. So sometimes you have energy and business imperatives to engage more. Other times it's just less. I mean, people involved in this process are human beings, and sometimes just something isn't as interesting to you as the thing you were working on last year, so you devote less time to it. Nobody's a machine. You mentioned pesky people and their annoying differences earlier, and standards people are pesky people too.
Yes.
You mentioned the CEO of the W3C. Isn't that you?
No, it's a very capable person called Seth Dobbs who joined almost exactly a year ago, actually November last year. And he's a terrific person for whom I have a great deal of time.
But didn't you recently get elected to be Queen of W3C or something like that? Was it Princess?
Princess. That's the one. So just over 2 years ago, the W3C became a legal entity in its own right, which might surprise everybody who thinks it's been
Hang
around
on.
for 30 years, right?
What was it before then?
It was an agreement, a contracted agreement between four academic institutions, MIT in the US, Keio in Japan, Beihang in China, and ERSIM in France. But a four-way complicated agreement like that made it very hard to do a lot of things. Raising money, for example. If W3C is not an organization in its own right, and you want to contribute to support it, how do you do that? So simple things. So there was a huge multi-year effort that came to its conclusion. And so January the 1st, 2023, W3C Inc., is its official title, became a legal entity in its own right. MIT stepped out of the relationship at that point, but the other three organizations still remain, but they're now partners rather than this sort of four-way agreement. So a board at that point came into effect because W3C is now a registered charity, and so needs proper governance in place. So yes, to your question, I got re-elected to the board in September, and then they made me chair of the board. Which is, don't know if that's better or worse than being princess, but we'll see.
I don't know. Did they give you a tiara?
No, damn it! I should demand one. One of those.
I definitely think a tiara and maybe an onyx throne surrounded by imposing statues of Anubis should be.
You think that will do it?
Yeah. So, what, as chair of the board of W3C Inc., which makes you sound like you have a volcanic lair somewhere, but
please, can I?
What do you actually have to do? Is it tech work or is it?
No, this is very much on the governance side of things. So the board of any non-profit organization oversees how the organization is run. So we get to do really exciting things like approve the annual budget. Talk about the kind of strategic direction that the organization wants to take. That's actually a big piece of what we're going to be working on this year as a board with Seth as CEO. So it really is the governance side of the organization. And in fact, because the W3C is a technical standards organization, and because it's a member-led consortium, the bylaws for the legal entity actually have a very clear boundary between running the organization and its technical agenda, which remains firmly in the hands of the members at large, if that makes sense. So the board actually keeps right out of the way of the technical conversation. Our job is to make sure that with the team, we're keeping the lights on and that there is an organization in which everybody else can crack on with the technical work.
Do you like doing stuff like this? I mean, for me, this sounds like personal hell, sort of logistics and paperwork. And this is stuff I run a mile from.
I mean, I must enjoy it to a certain extent. Otherwise, I wouldn't have signed up to, for the second election for a second term. No, it's not a particularly enjoyable, way to spend my time. But it comes down to that. You asked at the beginning, why did TetraLogical do so much? It's because it's worthwhile. And in the W3C, for all that there are many different members of different shapes and sizes, it's the larger companies, that often have the time, the money, the inclination to be able to sort of participate at this level, not exclusively. And I've always thought it was incredibly important to make sure that the voices of tiny little companies, were in that conversation as well. Actually, as of the election, we've actually now got one person who is a freelance contractor who got elected. So we really do have the full gamut of kind of voices on the board, from, as I say, an individual practitioner through to my tiny little company, through to the likes of NTT, Alibaba, Google. And I think that's important. So that's a big part, of the reason for me why I do it is because W3C actually has many more members who are in the SME, small to medium enterprise kind of category, and making sure that we've got a place at that table seemed like a good idea to me.
100%. It's one of the things I most enjoyed about the HTML5 process was that because it was all done on mailing lists, anybody could email, and you get really good ideas from, a woman who's a comp sci graduate in Bangalore whose ideas were trumping those of a senior engineer at Microsoft simply because it was a better idea. It was, I mean, I don't know if in our real world of commerce, a true meritocracy can really exist, but one can aspire to it anyway. And again, as you said at the beginning, diversity of voices and making the standard, I think is an absolute prerequisite to the standard working for the diverse population of the planet. It's
Yeah, it absolutely is. And, to your point about, the HTML working group back then and the open mailing lists, and that's become more and more prevalent at W3C in the intervening, well, how are we? God, 10 years, isn't it, since HTML5 was released? Now most of it's on GitHub, though. But equally, if you're kind of interested in one of the specs, say, that Web Apps is working on, you can go and look at all the issues. You can read the spec, you can file issues. No matter who you are, you don't have to be a member of the W3C. Don't even really have to have done anything, relating to the W3C at all. It's only really when the kind of stuff gets written into specs that you do need to be a member of the W3C, and that's for a very good reason, and that's for the patent policy, and that's the bit, without getting into all kinds of legalese, basically says if you contribute something to a spec, you waive your patent rights to it, and that's the bit that means all W3C standards will remain open, free for the rest of us to use in perpetuity, which is an extraordinary thing. It's increasingly common in standards organizations now to have something like that in place, but it's an amazing thing that we should always be able to use these technologies to do the stuff we need to do.
So if you're a member, as a paying member of the W3C, you and your organization that you represent waive any patents on the stuff that you're talking about right now today. Obviously, you're not waiving patents on anything, but
that's essentially it. Yes, there are key points at the same points where the horizontal review we were chatting about earlier gets triggered. There are what they call sort of patent exclusion opportunities, and that's when, if you're the sort of company that has patent lawyers, and needs patent lawyers, they get in, they have a look at the spec, they check it all out. But essentially, by the time a spec is released, all of those conversations have been had and resolved and sorted out. So what gets released is, royalty free and will stay that way.
That's incredible, isn't it? That's an amazing thing. So these specs are open forever now.
Yep, absolutely. Because can you imagine if somebody just suddenly came along and said, right, HTML, you're all going to have to pay to use it. Oh, bloody hell. I mean, it almost couldn't happen.
Yes. But it has happened. I remember, it's got to be at least 20 years ago now, somebody called Aolas said that they had the patent on plugins showing content before they were clicked on. So Internet Explorer had to I think Microsoft had to pay $500 million, and this was 2003, and they had to rejig Internet Explorer so that if there was a Flash movie, and that was, or a Flash game, it couldn't start until somebody had clicked on it. I may have the details wrong. I'll send them to you later. And folks, if I haven't actually just made this up in a brain fever, I'll post the links in the show notes, and I'll also link to your site, Léonie, which is tink.uk, if I recall correctly.
It is, yes.
Is it true that you're planning to change your name to Tim Berners-Lee and run the W3 single-handedly?
I suspect Tim might have something to say about that, but no, My master plan is far more cunning and devious than that. No, not at all. I'm quite happy doing what I do.
Oh, Tim. You call him Tim, not Sir Tim or Sir Uncle Timbo, just Tim.
I do, yes. Mostly as a product. He was is still part of the board. So yeah.
Right, he's not director anymore, is he? He's part of the board.
He's not. Yeah, no, he's stepped back from that in the past few months. But yeah, certainly through the bulk of the first term of the board, the first couple of years. Yeah, he was very much there.
I could imagine being Captain Webb and Captain of W3C with all the incessant, sweet, harmonious voices all agreeing with each other all the time can get quite grueling.
You might think so. I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, I mean, Sir Uncle Timbo is not in the first flush of youth like you and I are either, is he?
No, this is true. Yes, he's certainly at the point in life where winding things down would be on most people's futures, I suspect.
But he's still involved in some capacity, which is nice to know, because he is like the web wizard.
He really is. Yes.
Well, tell him I send hugs.
I will do.
He once asked me to sign a copy of my HTML5 book, I'll have you know.
Oh, did he? Is that the one where you got everybody to take pictures of it strategically?
Yes.
Tell me you asked him.
No, I didn't ask. And actually, it's not like he ran. It's not like he ran up to me and went, "Oh, Bruce, I'm so glad you're here." It's I actually had a spare copy and found myself sitting next to him at an event. So I went,
Yeah.
"You might as well have this, then, Sir Uncle Timbo." And he looked at me, panicked, and went, "You should sign it," which obviously meant, "So I know what your bloody name is." So I did.
The second time I ever met Tim in person was at a W3C TPAC, and this person, it was in one of those crowded sort of network things, lots of noise going on, and somebody walked up and said hello to me and the person I was talking to, and I completely mistook it for somebody I knew at the time very well and hugged him. And it was only about 30 seconds later that my brain went, "You've just randomly hugged Tim Berners-Lee, and he probably doesn't know you from Adam at this stage of the thing." But
well, at least you didn't snog him.
Well, this is true. It could have been an awful lot worse, couldn't it? Yeah.
For international listeners, snog is to passionately kiss in the slang employed in the playgrounds in the 70s and 80s when Léonie and I were in playgrounds rather than living it up on the climbing frame of web organizations. Okay, I know I've taken up loads of your time, Ms. Watson, so back to accessibility, which is where you and I originally started our glittering careers. Is it getting worse or is it getting better overall on the web?
Yes.
I could tell you're a chair of a board.
Okay, I got you. So I think it's getting better, but achieving better is getting harder. You know.
Okay.
It's a really odd one to. Sorry, I'm not articulating it very well either. But you know, if I think back to sort of the early 2000s, the worst we had to worry about was some forms, PDFs, Flash. Obviously, we sort of disposed of Flash somewhere along the way. PDFs, well, yeah. But then things got complicated. We introduced different kinds of devices. So where we were talking about keyboards, mice, and monitors, we're now talking about touchscreens. We're talking about web on the TV, web on your watch, web on your phone, iPad. Screen sizes and shapes have just changed. Interaction modes have changed. People are doing things in so many different ways. Talking to your tech as much as tapping it, clicking it, whatever. So even just looking at the devices and the interaction stuff got more complicated, and then we've just changed the way web stuff is developed so much. Back when I started, you literally text file, write your HTML, write your CSS, write your JavaScript for what it was worth. Now of course, we're living in an era where nobody writes any code other than JavaScript commands, really. And that abstraction has proved a massive complication, I think. So we're building more complicated stuff, but I think the accessibility is probably holding steady, which actually means I suspect we're getting better at it.
Oh, that's encouraging. I was reading a blog post this morning from our mutual friends at the Paciello group, and it was called, from memory, the remediation gap. And somebody was saying, because I used to be an accessibility consultant, and so I would, write in reports, well, you need alt text on this image, or you need an ARIA label. But the trouble is, there's a lot of, inverted commas, full stack developers who are working with JavaScript. They're calling in potentially external component libraries, and they don't have any control over the HTML that actually gets squirted onto the page. So often the advice that we've traditionally given to people, to developers, they can't actually action because they're not in control of that particular layer, which terrifies me. And it's kind of why I got out of the accessibility consultancy.
I mean, yeah, it's very true. I think to some extent that post was interesting because it made a very good point in that, those of us who are consultants in all of this need to have an understanding of how, React, jQuery even, because it's still remarkably popular, Vue, Emma, whatever, works. But of course, none of us are jobbing developers. So keeping that knowledge maintained and relevant is really, really hard. But we do have to have some understanding to be able to help the people picking up the tickets that we write, join the dots, if you see what I mean. I do think the one thing that was interesting about that post, though, which surprised me, was that I think it said something like it's only about 30%, 40% of websites actually are using these frameworks. I thought it was more than that, if you'd asked me before I read it. So there's still an awful lot of sites out there that are not bogged down in all of these things. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. But yeah, you're right. It is getting a lot harder for people on the ground to fix issues because they're not the ones, as you say, controlling what's getting spat out by the browser at the end of the day. And that really is the responsibility of the people who create these things. So yeah, it needs to pull its bloody finger out and sort out React, quite frankly.
That's gonna be my headline. The new Tim Berners-Lee says Facebook needs to pull its bloody finger out. No,
React is monstrosity to begin with, but that's a whole other conversation. But seriously, it's the people, the communities who are responsible for these frameworks that need to make sure that what their frameworks enable people to do have accessibility and a bunch of other stuff, privacy, security, built into it. Because, people in project teams now, they're given a deadline. Frameworks are great in many respects, rapid release, more iterative kind of development, all of that stuff. There's some really good stuff in there, performance notwithstanding. We can't expect people, just rocking up to work, just trying to get their job done, to fix the tools that they're, required to use. It's not even like they, most of the time, decided. That decision was taken by whoever, however long ago. So yeah, I really do hold the as I say, the communities, the organizations that are responsible for these frameworks, their responsibility.
And it's a huge opportunity for them. I mean, at the moment, I'm not sure when this will go out, but for listeners, this is October 30th. We're recording this. At the moment, there's a lot of controversy going on about in the WordPress community, but I've been a long-term WordPress user. It powers 40+% of the internet. And whereas in the back end of WordPress, it might start to use React or jQuery now, the front end is pretty much static HTML. And they've taken traditionally, it's been a really accessible project. You make a WordPress site and you're good to go. So when that powered 40% of the web, that meant a lot of the web became a lot more accessible. So if Mr. Zuckerberg, if you're listening, if you could just fix React, it's a great opportunity to make the web better. And if you are listening, Mr. Zuckerberg, you're welcome to come on here and debate with me and Léonie, and maybe Sir Tim. Okay, I need to let you go, madam, because you've got a multi-billion accessibility empire to run and people to fire and heads to crack.
Mm-hmm.
To our listeners who might be jobbing web developers, what is something you can do right now, today, to make sure your websites are more accessible?
I think the one thing I would suggest is use your tab key to test whatever it is you're about to release.
What does a tab key do?
So if you're a keyboard user, someone who can't use a mouse, which actually as developers, I suspect most people have a pretty keen understanding of what that actually means, because it's quicker using a keyboard a lot of the time. But just go through whatever it is you've just built. Use your tab key. That'll move your focus between focusable things like links, buttons, form fields. Make sure that you can activate stuff with the keyboard, hit the enter key or hit the space key. Just get into the habit of doing that. And if anything doesn't work and you find yourself reaching for your mouse to get it to work, fix it before you ship it. Keyboard accessibility is still one of the biggest problems that I think exists in accessibility terms, and so many people benefit when it's right. Not just sighted keyboard users, people with physical disabilities who can't use a mouse, people like me who use assistive technologies. I do everything with the keyboard and my screen reader because I can't see to point and click. It's just literally so many people will benefit if you just test and fix that one thing. And I will send you a link, Bruce, if you don't mind. There's a quick video that TetraLogical produced. It's like a minute long, and it's a quick guided tour on how to test that. If you can get into the habit of doing that, there's a hell of a lot of people you'll be helping out.
I'd be absolutely delighted to post the link in the show notes, Léonie.
Oh, thank you.
With that note, as I say, you have your empire to run and your tiara to get your butler to polish.
I've got to find the tiara though.
If you don't have one, I will send you a Vivaldi tiara. Don't worry.
That's a promise now.
It's a promise. I don't think we have one, but I think I can codge one together from some things that my daughter left in her bedroom when she moved out. So it'll be good. Thank you so much for joining us. And as the Americans will say, thank you for your service, making the web a better place, because you're working with W3C and talking to me when you could be doing billable work with tech giants. So thank you for that.
Welcome. Thank you for asking me.
And thank you for listening, everybody. As usual, this will be published on the Vivaldi site with a full HTML transcript and links to all the things that we've spoken about. And we'll see you next time. Léonie, thank you. TetraLogical are available for hire, everybody. Until next time, thank you very much for a better web. Bye.
Goodbye.